course, early part is when around Christmas time. I guess when we were having it the roughest, and it was it was really tough. And I don't think I'll ever forget the Battle of Guernsey. That's a little town about the size of Westall, and we had a lot of tanks attached to our division, and I think it was around 110 tanks that we counted that had been knocked out around that little town alone. In fact, that was the biggest tank battle of the whole war, was Guernsey. And of course, a great many of those tanks were theirs, and a great many of them, of course, were American. And of course, we also had some British flamethrowers in our outfit. They could attach to us, and they fought to the north of us, and they could throw flames of fire for 150 yards, which came in real handy with some of these tank battles. But if you never fought next to the British, you miss an experience, because they take things pretty lightly. In other words, they move at night, they move with their headlights on, whereby we had to move everywhere with our lights off. And sometimes when they'd be moving into places that we'd be moving out of, they'd come in with their headlights on. And of course, as soon as Germans see these headlights, of course, they start firing into us. And it's really not the best thing in the world to be fighting next to the British, because they walk around out in the middle of the field without a steel helmet on or anything. They weren't afraid of anything. After we'd been over there several weeks and been in combat, we were given 2 or 3 days off to rest. So we would go back into Holland and Brussels, Belgium, some, and in Herleen, they had a coal mine where they had people work at that time, and they had baths there where you could take showers, and we'd go, some of us go a week, 2 weeks without even having a bath, so we had to go back there to get a bath. And of course, going across the Ruhr, that's where we probably spent most of our time. That was the longest night I've ever seen in my life. They were trying to bomb. We had pontoon bridges out that the engineers had put across. We were trying to get across those. And we had, of course, thousands of troops to move across. So it was slow moving across. And of course, at the time we went down to get on the pontoon, I saw an airplane come overhead and turn his bombs loose. And they were coming down as we were fixing to get on the pontoon. But of course, thank goodness they missed their target by some 200 or 300 yards. So they didn't hit the bridge that we were on. And as soon as we got across the bridge, then of course all of our vehicles were stacked up bumper to bumper for a mile or so on each road. And of course they were still trying to throw artillery in on us, and of course bombing too. Most people, when they'd stop, they'd get out and get under their vehicles to keep from getting hit by shrapnel. And of course there were people screaming and hollering that had gotten out away from the road or gotten into landmines. And you just, once you got out in the field, you didn't know what might be there. So a lot of them got their arms blown off or their legs blown off by by landmines, and of course we had hospitals set up, temporary hospitals in basements and one thing and another of houses, but we couldn't get people in and out there because the roads were all being used. So it was a terrible night. And of course, the next day or so was trying to get people with a mile or two across so we could move. And we would move, of course, down the road. Of course, they knew everything we were doing at that time. So they were strafing our vehicles. In fact, one had a vehicle, about 6 vehicles ahead of our vehicle. Had a truck, bounced off the cab of it, went flying through the air, and I don't know whatever happened to the rest of it. But they came pretty close to you when they were strafing. It was a little bit slow going for several weeks, I guess for probably about 3 months after we crossed the Aurora River. And during that time, I believe that was around Christmas time, and the Germans decided to make an all-out effort to try to get us to change our minds. So they put on a final push toward Antwerp. We were the northernmost troops of the Americans in that at that time, and the British, of course, was right north of us, and they were going to try to make it to Antwerp and cut us off. And of course, we put barbed wire, and we of course, the engineer did most of it. They put the wire out, and they fixed all the trees, put wires on them so they could make them fall over into the roads and so forth. And we were stretched out, one division was stretched out over about 75 miles, which made us a little bit thin. And we would have had a hard time had they had enough people to push at us. But they never did accomplish their goal. So happened, we were all right. And of course, that was about the time the Battle of Bastogne. No, that was a little after the time Bastogne deal where what was his name? Patton. Well, let me turn it on. And somewhere along about this time, it's hard for me to remember all this, but somewhere about this time we ran into all these pillboxes and dragon's teeth where you couldn't get vehicles through. They'd have concrete thing, look kind of like teeth just sticking up, and you couldn't get vehicles through them unless you blasted all that concrete down wide enough to get a vehicle through. Of course, these pillboxes they had were kind of like concrete basements, and they'd have paths tunnels leading from one to another, and they had that would go on for say a mile. That they'd have a pillbox and then a tunnel to get to another one, and so we had quite a time ever getting through this part of it. We would attach a self-propel howitzer like ours, which shot directly. You had to get them up where you could shoot direct into the pillboxes. The pillboxes would usually extend up about 3 or 4 feet above the ground, but most of it would be underground and be made out of concrete anywhere from 1 foot thick to 3 feet thick. And sometimes we'd blast those, or it's direct guns would blast those where maybe people get scared and run out, and of course Then if they came out, well, they ran into the other kind of artillery fire. And one morning we spent the whole morning up in the steeple of a church blasting these pillboxes. And of course, every now and then they would shoot back at us in these churches, and you had to be pretty quick on your feet to get down those steps and get down to the basement until they let up for a while, and then you could go back and do your work. And of course, that whole time too, there was snow on the ground, whereby pretty easy to see them if they got, outside, but not many of them came out of those pillboxes. And these dragon teeth, you had to, you had to do away with those before you could get through there. Of course, after we once got through this part of it, we traveled pretty fast then. We moved along pretty good, and we would come to these. In fact, I believe I still have a bunch of pictures that my driver took of a barn that had a bunch of hay in it, and a whole bunch of our prisoners had been burned. Showed pictures of guys who had their heads out the edge of the door when they died by being burnt. And then they had buried a lot of these people, and some of these places, of course, were just like they set them on fire, and then they just took off to the rear, trying to keep them getting caught as we approached. And in fact, we went to Buchenwald prison camp too, as we went through, and that was a prison camp. I think originally it was set up to put the Jews in, but I think later they put a lot of our prisoners in it, and it was one part of it was a basement-like thing with a big oven in it, and they had a stretcher made out of metal that they could put a person on and just strap them down with metal and put them in this big oven and burn them to ashes. And in this basement-like type thing, the walls were a good 1.5 feet thick, and it showed around the doors where people just scratched with their fingernails, scratched that concrete where they'd have indentures into the wall at least an inch and a half deep, where people were trying to, find a way to get out of the place. And of course, when we went through there, there weren't any there. They'd either burnt them all, or killed them all, or taken them with them. I don't think they took too many with them at that time. They were just trying to get away themselves. Of course, too, after we saw a lot of these places, we had even less use for the Germans, and we felt like anything that we did to them was easy compared with what they'd done to our people. We were moving, as I say, we were moving pretty fast. This time we might maybe go 15 or 20 miles in a day at that time. So we were running into a few incidental food items that some of us enjoyed pretty much. Overseas, mainly, we had C rations and K rations. I don't know if you know what these are, but of course C rations consisted of cans of, they had one can that had beans, and they had one can that had spaghetti. Those are the two mainly that I remember that got the most and what they would do, they just take the labels off the cans and drop them in a 50-gallon barrel of hot water, and they would heat them. That's the way they were heated, and they could put as many as 500, 1,000 cans, feed that many people at one time. And of course, when you got in line to get your food, you didn't know whether you're going to get a can of spaghetti or a can of beans. But whichever one you got, well, most time you're kind of glad to get it. And of course, the K rations, that consisted mainly of crackers of different kinds, one or another, as I remember it. And I believe there was a little cheese in there. Of course, it was, most of the time it was so old that didn't taste too well. And of course, as we were moving fairly fast, we'd run into places where they maybe have some food that they had left from factories that we confiscated. I can remember very well one afternoon, my driver and I and probably a few other people came upon this factory that had canned sardines, and we got us a whole carton of those things, put them on our Jeep, and we had enough sardines for the next day or two. It's kind of hard to think of a sardine later on, but they sure did come in good at that time. We thought they were great. As I was saying, we were traveling pretty good along about this time, and we were, during part of this time, we were having to put people out of their homes. A lot of them knew that the war was going to be over pretty quick. I think a lot of them knew that it probably wouldn't last very long, and they weren't leaving. They just stayed at their places, and if we wanted to use their houses at night, we just had to use them and put them out wherever. We were going. We were, as I said earlier, we were some of the most northern American troops, and we were directly in line with Berlin, and traveling pretty good. And at that time too, every once in a while we could get a little fresh food, but chickens, if a hen lay an egg, well, of course we would get it, and we were most happy because other eggs that we had were those powdered eggs, and we didn't get them just too often. And of course, we began to take more prisoners all the time. Most of them are getting to the point they were ready for the war to be over, and they sure didn't want the Russians to get them. So we advanced to the Elbe River, and they told us not to go any further. And they failed to get word to some of the tank groups, and some of the tank groups went well past the Elbe River before they got word to them not to go past the Elbe. So they had to withdraw back across the Elbe River, which was about, before I remember, it was about 35 miles from Berlin. So we could have been in Berlin in about 2 more days if they would have let us go. But they said no. And about that time, the Russians started swimming, not the Russians, the Germans started swimming the river to get away from the Russians, because they sure didn't want to get the Russians to get a hold of them. So we had them just surrendering, swimming the river and surrendering. And we just tell them to throw their guns in the pile over there, and then just send them on back to the rear. And we could have had an old gym full of guns if we had a way to get them home and wanted them. But I brought 4 home with me. One that I took off of prisoner early in the war, and then plus 3 others. 2 P-38s, and that 132 Belgium gun that I still have. Of course, after the war was over and they surrendered, we had to stay there quite some time and do more or less government work, I guess you'd call it. We were responsible for all the prisoners. We were responsible for the displaced people who left their country. Of course, when the war was over there, the thing in Pacific was still on, and of course we knew that probably we would all be going over there after we came back through the States. So the ones with the least points were sent home first, with the idea that they'd be the first troops to go on to fight in the Pacific. And of course, some of us that had several points would staying over there to take care of the thing over there, and of course they couldn't ship them all home anyway, so we were responsible for their government mainly and everything else for several months. In fact, one of my additional jobs over there was to see that we had enough wood cut in the county. A county over there was called a Landkreis, and one of my jobs was to see that everybody would have enough wood to last them through the winter for heat. And another one of my jobs was to fly over the area and make a map of all the county roads and all the roads in that area, so that everybody would have a map so they could know where each place was. And of course, we stayed, those people who were sent home to get ready to go to the Pacific after having a vacation. Of course, the war was over in the Pacific then, so they got out a lot quicker than the rest of us who had many more points, and so we felt like we kind of got jostled again. Of course, during that time, we usually got a week or 2 off to go on vacation over there, and several of us at one time would be gone. And I got to go to the Riviera for a week, and we had a great time at the Riviera. It was kind of a vacation spot for a lot of the European people, and we enjoyed that. And I was speaking of points, the ones that had the last points got to come home first. You got points several different ways. I don't know that I can tell you all of them, but you got so many points for each battle. Now, a lot of these places, a lot of these things had names. Different battles had names, and you got points for that. You got points for the amount of time you've been in. You got points for the number of months you were overseas. and you got points for if you had family, you had a wife or children, you got so many points for each one of those, and that's the way they were going to let you well get out when at the end, and so it was quite ordinary for them to take those with fewer points first if they were going to send them to the Pacific, and so we weren't fussing too much while we were staying over there, knowing that if we came home, we'd probably have to go in the Pacific pretty quick. But so happened that when the war was over, then over in the Pacific, we felt like we'd been neglected a little. Of course, going back, what happened during combat, the Germans were always trying to demoralize the American troops. They would drop pamphlets with writings and pictures on them. Some of the pictures would have, say, a boy and a girl kissing and saying, this is what, written on there would have, this is what your wife is doing back home while you're over here doing this. And some of them would have so pictures of and writing of people on strike back home while you're over here drawing the amount of money you're drawing and what they were getting back there and wanting more money. And they did everything. They dropped all kinds of pamphlets with stuff on them showing, trying to demoralize the troops to get them to quit fighting. While we were on this occupational duty, whereby we was running the county for everything, we also had a horse stable where we collected riding horses for people wanted to go riding to ride horses. They'd have a horse to ride. We had a Lieutenant Field, and he's originally from Paris, Texas, and he was the manager of our horses. And he loved horses, so he had some good ones. And he'd go out in the street if he saw a horse and buggy coming down the road. He'd walk out in the street and wait for them. And when they'd get down there, he'd stop them, and he'd go all around the horse looking him over. And if he found a horse he liked, he'd just tell one of the other boys to go down to the stable and get old so-and-so and bring him up there. So he just traded horses with the guy or lady, whoever it happened to be. He'd take the horse out from the buggy and put the other horse in and send them on their way. And he had real good horses. And of course, some of the guys that had never been hunting and never ridden horses very much, they'd go out in the wood deer hunting and try to shoot a deer off the horse. And usually when they did that, the horse threw them about 20 feet high. And some of them learned lessons that they didn't expect to learn in the service. On our trip home, our first mode of transportation was on an old train. We rode this train. It didn't have any stoves on it. It didn't have any kind of heat. So someone got some old stove and put on there, and of course put the smoke. Stovepipe, put stovepipe out the window, and of course the first pole we went by knocked the thing off the stove, and all we got mainly was smoke. And we spent 72 hours on that train going about 500 miles through France. Of course, got back there, and they were, doing different things to get you ready to come home and so forth. And I had 2 footlockers. One of them was completely full of ammunition for all my guns that I was bringing home. And one afternoon, while I went over to PX, while I was over there, my tent caught on fire, and we were talking. Somebody said, "Your tent's on fire." So the first thing I thought of was my wooden footlocker full of ammunition, and so I knew I'd get in real trouble if that started going off there. And it was sitting up in the corner, and it must have weighed 200 pounds at least, and is all I could do. If I hadn't been scared, I don't think I could have jerked that footlocker outside. And it was already on fire. The top of it was burning, and I threw a blanket over the top of that, put the fire out. And by then we had MPs all around there looking and everything. And so that night I took it down to the latrine and dumped all my ammunition into the latrine. And so that was one little incident that happened to me on the way. And then, of course, coming back, I think it's even worse ships than we had going over. And all over again, lots of them were getting sick. Of course, the only thing that happened there, we didn't have to dodge this way and that way and every which way to get home. We come straight, but I think that only took 11 days. But then we got back to Virginia, Newport, I believe it was, Virginia. We couldn't unload. We got back there on New Year's Eve, and all the dock men were vacationing for New Year's Eve, and they docked us out in the ocean about 2 miles out, and or maybe it's further than that, but it was too far to swim, although I think some of them were about ready to try to swim to shore. So we sat out there for 2 nights while the shoremen had their New Year's Eve and New Year's holiday, and then we got there, and then it took about 3 days there, and then we was shipped back to Tyler, Texas, I believe it was, and that's where the Army cut me loose and paid my mustering out pay. They paid you for your vacation time you had coming, and paid you so much for, well, I don't remember all, but I know I got about $2,500, and I thought that was the most money I'd ever seen in my life. And so caught a bus there and came to Austin, and of course there Jerry was waiting for me, and George and Lenny were there too, waiting for me. And I took 2 or 3 weeks vacation and then went back to school in Central State, Oklahoma. I liked 8 hours to have my degree at that time. So I went to school there in the spring and lettered both in baseball and track in spring, and got my degree in the summer, and of course started coaching in Laredo at that time.